Early in its invasion of Ukraine, when the world turned a collective cold shoulder to it, Russia claimed that the Russian-Chinese partnership was one of no limits. Not long after, the Chinese were quick to rectify the sentiment and make it clear that there were indeed limits to this relationship, with its only real friends being Iran and North Korea. If Russia wants to win the war in Ukraine, it desperately needs China's support, but China has other plans, and it would like nothing better than if Russia lost this war. And not just any loss, the more catastrophic the better. Russia's war to defeat Russia by invading Ukraine is putting the nation in an increasingly tough position as the conflict enters the 18-month mark. Initially, sanctions against the country barely made a dent on its economy, thanks to booming energy revenues as the Western world bought up vast reserves of Russian energy in order to shore up for looming sanctions. But the boom times are over, and now Western price caps on Russian energy are gutting government revenues. These price caps allow Russia just enough leeway to keep selling oil and gas and thus avoid a global energy crisis, but not enough for Russia to turn a profit. In effect, Russia's greatest source of revenue has been reduced to a break-even state, even as the country taxes oil income according to the price of Brent crude rather than its own. This is cannibalizing its own energy industry just to continue financing the costly war in Ukraine. Even worse, as Russia switched to sell oil to India, they tried to make up its losses of Western business, and the Indian government demanded that all sales be made in rupees instead of rubles. This has left Russia with a massive quantity of Indian rupees, which have very limited use on the international market as most nations trade in either dollars or euro. Russia also doesn't need much of what India is willing to export, meaning it can't use those rupees to buy the Indian goods it might need. This growing stockpile of rupees is effectively worthless to Russia unless the world suddenly switches to the rupee as the global reserve currency in the near future. On top of income woes, Russia is dealing with a catastrophic shortage of badly needed products for the manufacture of advanced weapons. Sanctions on semiconductor sales to Russia have reduced its military to scrounging for chips from consumer goods like dishwashers, and it's being forced to buy drones from countries like Iran under deals that heavily favor Iran. In the wake of the Russian invasion in Ukraine, the world learned that while Russia is a huge arms exporter, it was extremely reliant on advanced components from around the world to actually produce sophisticated arms. Without those components, the Russian defense industry can only manage to chug out a few advanced weapon systems per month, an estimated 20 tanks per month, for example, and in a questionable state of modernity to boot. China has helped alleviate some of the pressure that Russia is currently under. It has greatly expanded its import of Russian energy in the wake of Western sanctions and allows Russia to use its own financial institutions to undertake some transactions and evade Western restrictions. Further, there's good intelligence announced by the Americans that Chinese defense firms have been providing vital equipment to the Russian war effort. It was long feared that China would announce their full-blown support for Russia in a similar style as Ukraine enjoys from the West. Everything from Chinese tanks to artillery and especially missiles were feared to be crossing the border into Russia, replenishing its stockpiles and significantly expanding Russia's ability to continue waging this war. Despite Ukraine's many successes, it remains outgunned and outmanned by the vastly larger Russian military, which has the good fortune of access to vast stocks of Cold War equipment that still enjoys some battlefield utility. But those stocks are increasingly running out, and China was feared to be the key to replenishing Russian shortages. So far, there's been no sign of heavy equipment being transferred to Russia, despite President Vladimir Putin doubtlessly asking for it during his meetings with China's Xi Jinping. What we do know is that there is increasing evidence that the Chinese government is actively aiding Russia in evading sanctions, transferring large amounts of dual-use hardware like drones and computer chips to feed its ever-hungry defense industry. Chinese state-owned defense companies have shipped everything from badly needed spare parts for combat jets to navigation equipment. And just between March and July of 2023, Chinese companies sold Russia over $12 million in drones and drone parts. For their part, the Chinese have claimed that they're not selling Russia any weapons, which so far seems to be true. However, they also claim that any dual-use items being transferred to Russia are, quote, above board. This is objectively false, given that it took U.S. intelligence and third-party researchers to begin to discover the scope of what China is supplying to Russia. But it's not just parts that could be used in military drones that China is sneaking into Russia. China is now the largest importer of Russian oil in the world, dethroning India for that title in March of 2023. While Russia has not been able to make up all it lost in sales to the West, China now imports twice the amount of liquefied petroleum gas than it did in 2021, and crude oil imports are around 1.65 million barrels a day. One of the most painful blows to the Russian economy was sanctions by the West, which forbade Western insurance agencies from ensuring any ship used to transport Russian oil. This meant that Russia didn't just lose access to European tanker fleets, but to international fleets insured by European companies. That left it with few options with which to ship oil, given that pipelines to alternate markets are few and so specialized that only very specific products could be sent through them anyway. But here too, China's helping Russia out by providing its own supertankers and granting insurance to third-party tankers transferring Russian energy goods. According to an anonymous Chinese executive, China provided 18 supertankers and insured a further 16 third-party vessels in 2023, shipping 15 million metric tons of crude oil. It looks like, short of providing Russia with weapons, China's doing everything it can to help Russia win. But on closer inspection, this is far from the truth, because the truth is, China is only interested in China, and even its aid to Russia is completely in its own interest, and it comes at an increasingly high cost to Russia's continued independence. Now, that last part is not a flaw, it's a feature of Chinese aid. China's been accused of using its Belt and Road Economic Initiative to spread what some have called, quote, debt trap diplomacy. There's varying levels of truth to this, but when looking at China's alleged support for Russia, it's hard to not see how China has its own interests front and center, to the great detriment of the Russians. Firstly, most of the transactions between Russia and China are now being conducted with the Chinese yuan, with the amount of total Russian exports conducted in yuan increasing from half a percentage point pre-war to 14% today. This is both a reflection of Russia's increasing shift toward Chinese markets and the Chinese demanding that trade be conducted in their own currency, strengthening the Chinese yuan directly. For the first time in history, the Chinese yuan is the most used currency inside of China itself for cross-border transactions. Globally, the yuan, or renminbi, rose to 2.7% of global foreign exchange reserves in 2022. This is good news for China, but bad news for Russia, since, like its situation with India, it's now left with huge cash reserves of a currency that only a very small amount of global trade is undertaken with. At least China's more sophisticated economy is able to offer Russia more of the goods and services it needs, and thus provide a chance to use those yuan reserves, but it can't provide everything, still leaving Russia with significant yuan reserves it cannot do much with. But the bigger picture overall is one where Russia's effectively forced to sell its energy for two currencies that the vast majority of the world doesn't do business with, meaning that the longer Russia is left under sanctions, the more dependent it becomes on India and China, since those are the only two currencies it has left in significant reserves, and nobody else wants them. China's political support is likewise completely self-serving. When Russia announced its no-limits partnership, China was quick to correct the record in order to not offend the West, where it has significant investments. To date, Chinese support has been tepid at best, with the nation calling for a, quote, equitable peace for both sides. What exactly that entails remains ambiguous, with China careful to word its 12-point peace plan in a way that leaves it completely unclear as to how it views a valid resolution to the war in Ukraine. In point number 1, China calls for both parties to observe the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of all countries, but this peace plan was presented after Russia annexed eastern Ukraine. So, does China support returning Ukrainian sovereignty to the annexed provinces, or does it support Russian claims of sovereignty? Nobody but the Chinese know, leaving their position pleasantly ambiguous, to their own benefit and to the detriment of Russia. With most of the world not recognizing its annexation of Ukrainian territory, Russia needs a significant world power to recognize its claims, or it'll lose them entirely. But as the world becomes increasingly polarized between liberal democracies and authoritarian dictatorships, why would China not fully embrace a like-minded authoritarian state? Why, in reality, does China want Russia to lose the war in Ukraine? It all comes down to what China needs in order to continue prospering and pursue its ultimate goal of dethroning the US as the sole global superpower. And Russia has everything China needs to accomplish this. Relations between the two states have varied wildly, from warm friendship during the first part of the Cold War to mutual distrust and even outright border conflicts in the second half. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia was still the big boy on the block and China the junior partner. But the Chinese dragon has completely overtaken the Russian bear, with China now dwarfing it not just economically but politically and militarily as well. Russia's only remaining advantage over China is its nuclear arsenal, but with the state of the military on full display in Ukraine, there are serious questions as to the efficacy of an arsenal even bigger than that of the US. China's working to close that gap too, with massive investment in nuclear weapons in recent years, much to the world's detriment. China has a long memory of its treatment as a junior partner by the Soviet Union superpower, and continued by Russia until recently. It also remembers the territory stolen from it by the Russian Empire in 1858 under a set of humiliating treaties forced upon the Qin dynasty by the Russians. Russian Manchuria now includes the Amur Oblast and the southern half of the Khabarovsky Krai. It's not just national pride at stake, though, as Russian Manchuria happens to not just be strategically important, but also rich in energy resources and, most importantly, water. With China experiencing significant droughts, water shortages have put huge pressure on the nation, and the territory stolen from it by the Russian Empire happens to have two of the resources it needs most today. Russian Manchuria is only the tip of Chinese ambitions, though, because the greater prize is the entire Russian Far East. The RFE contains massive quantities of energy and other resources that remain largely unexplored and untapped. It is exactly these resources China is eyeing hungrily. Not only would it dramatically bolster the Chinese economy, but having access to those energy stockpiles would create a secure overland energy supply route directly to China. This is of significant concern when today China faces the very real prospect of having the U.S. Navy completely blockade its sea-based trade, which accounts for approximately 60% of its energy imports. Without the ability to challenge the U.S. Navy far from its own shores, having a vast supply of energy delivered via secure land routes would suddenly give China a lot of freedom to pursue some of its most aggressive foreign policy goals that the United States currently keeps in check, such as invading and annexing Taiwan. For its part, Russia has not helped Chinese ambitions in the region much. In 2014, Russia launched its Arctic Development Plan and did not include any Chinese involvement, nor did they make any mention of plans to prioritize Chinese energy needs. That's all changed as Russia has turned to China to finance significant infrastructure and energy exploration in the region. For the Russian political elite in Moscow, the situation is increasingly alarming. Not only are Russia's energy resources in its most far-flung region being financed by the Chinese, but China's own investments into the Russian Far East overall vastly outstrip its investments by the Russian federal government. Immigration, both legal and illegal, is creating a population that is increasingly more Chinese than Russian. In 20 to 30 years, it's feared that there will be more ethnic Chinese in the RFE than Russians. A concerning situation given the 113 million Chinese are sitting right across the border in neighboring Chinese provinces. Tensions between local Russians and Chinese populations are already nearing a boiling point. There's a deep resentment over the growing crowds of Chinese tourists who are said to be rude and patronize only Chinese businesses. In 2019, tensions came to a fever pitch over a Chinese-owned bottling plant on Lake Baikal, which is the world's deepest lake and holds 20% of the global freshwater supply. This Chinese plant would not only block local access to the water supply, but ship that water to China, where it's desperately needed. The Russian outrage was so pronounced that plans to build the plant were deemed illegal in Russian court. China's not done much to ease tensions and in fact seems to have signaled intentions to eventually retake Russian Manchuria. In 2023, Beijing approved the creation of official maps which showed the territories surrendered under the Qin dynasty under Chinese control and with their old Chinese names. The statement was clear: China wants what Russia has. And this is why China needs Russia to lose this war. And the worse it loses, the better. Russia's unlikely to simply allow demographics to shift ownership of the RFE from itself to China, even as a growing Chinese population creates an opportunity for an independence movement or an annexation by China. It is ironically exactly how Russia claimed justification for invading Ukraine: the protection of Russian speakers in eastern Ukraine. In another decade or two, China will have this exact same justification to move to annex the RFE, a region that's not just increasingly ethnically Chinese, but financially too. While China could absolutely defeat Russia in a conventional war, Russia is unlikely to let the RFE go peacefully and could resort to nuclear weapons to defend its territory. This is where a crippling loss in Ukraine would be to China's advantage, as such a loss would likely come with significant political upheaval, exactly the type of chaos China could use to make a move on the RFE, consolidating its hold before a fractured Russian state could properly react. In the end, it'd be a fitting fate for Russia to have its own territory annexed by a belligerent neighbor, but it would be a significant setback for the liberal world order, which has relied on the US Navy's ability to control Chinese trade to keep its worst ambitions in check. Now check out What If China Attacked Russia, or click this other video instead.